Right, so this is Mark.
Hello.
I'm Heiko, and we've known each other quite a long time. We're both involved in the Labour movement and Marxist movement in the militant tendency, the IMT, later both doing the Karl Marx walking tour. And we're having a discussion about the crisis of capitalism as manifest through the coronavirus crisis. So perhaps you want to fire away, Mark. Like, what's your...
I think as a got an echo. As a socialist, I think I went along with the whole, his looking back now, a bit of hysteria. It didn't quite sit well with me, but there's this sense of
get up to my height, otherwise you look.
Sense of doing the right thing for the common good. The virus is, an exceptional virus. It can kill anyone at any time. We don't know who's transmitting it. If you transmit it, you might be killing someone else. All these kind of things. I think, as most of the population have gone along, and even for conscious political people like myself, you kind of almost lulled into setting aside your instinctive kind of class. How can the Tories all of a sudden suspended the class war and now they're acting in that never sat well with me. And, for me, the class war never ends. It's the continuation. Any event that takes place can be manipulated, used, opportunities used to perpetuate the class war. And as the last few months have gone on, I think independently, I began to draw conclusions of quite skeptical about outcomes, benefits, actions, and over the last couple of weeks, certainly started to come across some very good research. Some of it, no doubt, is being used by people on the right as well, which makes you automatically tarred as some kind of right-wing conspiracy theorist. But the fact that some libertarians on the right also see the same factual evidence that the lockdown is not actually scientifically based, it doesn't necessarily validate that position, and if people from different parts of political spectrums are arriving at the same conclusions, it doesn't really bother me. But you automatically get labelled on the left. You must have moved to the right because you now agree with Toby Young, which is just quite ridiculous.
The 1848 revolutions were revolutions of a bourgeois democratic and a socialist character. So, and people arraigned themselves according to the facts of the events. The idea that you can, in a time like now, when the world has gone into probably the most bizarre, other than wartime, it's the most, but wartime we're familiar with, the bizarre behavior, which people draw parallels only with the Black Death. That's literally the only thing that's a parallel drawn. There are some people talk about Spanish flu, but of course there were no measures taken in Spanish flu. There was no lockdown. So the only lockdown that we got a comparison to, and even then there wasn't lockdown, is the plague. Or in the Italian city-states where quarantine was organized quite regularly because it was a shipping, Venice was a shipping nation and so on, and the ships would come in and out, and they had towers along the hills to try and monitor the quarantines and so on. But they weren't, again, medieval quarantines weren't quite the same thing as this. You didn't have a nationwide or global quarantine, So we entered into a strange world at the beginning of last year. And it just led to the abandonment of serious critical thinking, and of course that has had an impact on huge swathes of the population. It's particularly in Europe and the United States and in the Northern Hemisphere that it shook up people's thinking and drove people into sort of strange camps that had never been heard of before. You know, lockdown, anti-lockdown. There was someone was on the internet this morning, on Facebook a few minutes ago. I'm literally giving up on using this nonsense. But a few minutes ago, someone again who's always been on the left and all the rest of it, and profiled as a lefty. He literally said on there, anyone who's against lockdown is a mass murderer.
It's all thinking now.
It's crazy. And I said, look, you want to get hold of yourself, get a piece of paper, put a line down in the middle of it, arguments for lockdown, arguments against lockdown, or just put them down, write them down. Doesn't mean you agree. But if you can't argue with anyone, that's what you have to do.
Perhaps the government could start by giving us their rationale for lockdown, actually publish the cost benefits and the benefits, again, you know, how they've calculated and the science behind it. That would help the public probably start. But just going back to the original lockdown, as a worker, I was already made completely skeptical about the initial lockdown in terms of just the way it was dealt with. I just happened to, along with about 350,000 other workers, change jobs in March. And I'd held the same job, worked for the same company for 18 years. And I just happened through planning, wasn't, you know, I planned to leave my job in March. I, therefore, because I was considered a new starter, never qualified for any help whatsoever. And since then, I've had no financial help whatsoever. There's now close on 500,000 workers who have just been left to abandon, to go. I don't even qualify for universal credit because my wife's a nurse. And even though she only earns £16,000 a year, which is just pathetic, you know, we've had a little bit of help with council tax. We have to keep reporting every month what our income is. It's ridiculously bureaucratic. Other than that, and I've earned about 3,000 quid in between the various lockdowns when they've been released doing bits of part-time work. There's hundreds of thousands of workers. So even on those terms, where's the help? Then there's all the people who, I mean, anyone in the public sector.
All the low-grade self-employed as well.
I've got friends in the public sector, for instance, who are administering council tax. They all had to go to work. In the public sector, there's been no furloughing, apart from leisure centres and public sector places where people were, you know, leisure centres, swimming pools, controlled by maybe a local authority, though they would get furloughed. But the administrators in the town halls, in housing benefit, have all had to go to work. They're all at risk, and they're all going back home, supposedly, if we take it on the terms the government is saying. So how's the stay at home, don't mix? It's just so full of contradictions. It was no wonder that young people, my children, just couldn't make sense by the summer of what was going on and why they couldn't party. They couldn't go and meet their friends. They couldn't, you know, take a break from the A levels that they were supposed to have sat. That was the plan, and have a summer before, you know, going on to other things. It's just nonsense. And the more then you begin to look at it, you're really using just fear that isn't based in any kind of rationale. The virus, you know, has been portrayed as something which I accept. I kind of gone along with for a while. You know, it's new, it's dangerous, we don't know. This is, you know, in fact, none of that's true. And it's a specific demographics that are at risk. But really, I believe now quite clearly the coronavirus crisis has been used to mask the complete lack of provision of healthcare and social care that has been a result of austerity since, you know, since 2008 and earlier. And those 12, 15 years of austerity are coming home to roost. Coronavirus is the debt collector. He's collecting the debt for the austerity bill, and people are dying unnecessarily, not because they've got the virus, because they've not got the healthcare to treat the infection. Simple as that. And that is what the left should be. I mean,
it seems to be less the infection itself, although there are various prophylactic things that could have been done on health on the virus. again, utter incompetence. I mean, utter incompetence summarises the British government. There's no doubt about that. So that is an additional factor to any other factors about disease. Then comes long-term austerity and the impact on health. Then comes long-term austerity and the impact on healthcare provision. And then comes the gap between the treatment of non-communicable diseases, heart disease, diabetes, in the case of mixed stroke and things like that.
Yeah. So we've got an aging population who aren't actually got a better quality of life. Their quality of life is declining year on year. Even though they're living longer, they're not, most elderly people, very little socializing, trapped in care homes, at the behest of a care worker who might come and take you out. The care working industry itself is unregulated or minimal regulations. The quality of life for our elderly people is appalling. It's literally appalling. And even though they're living longer, I would say their quality of life is worse than it probably was in the 50s or the 60s, even though people lived less. So, and then coupled with that, bad diets, obesity, and untreated or not complete treatments for ailments that exist through old age is just ended up with a perfect storm for the virus to wreak havoc and in the target demographics. And that's not to say I am belittling or being flippant about, it's only old people dying, but the virus acts in a specific way. It has a specific target. If you're planning healthcare with all of these so-called experts, they all knew that coronavirus has a specific target. They could have been protected. Those people could have been protected.
Exactly.
And the rest of us,
the cost of protecting those people, I mean, I mentioned earlier on, I'll repeat it again. You could have provided a house in the countryside for any couple or individual, who felt at risk. You could have had 3-4 layers of protective provision for them by staff or, carers. You could have had the highest quality. You could have had food sent from Fortnum and Mason's. And it would have been a minuscule component of the price that we've paid financially for what's going on. And the huge majority of that have been some type of subsidies to the wealthy or to the corporate sector.
Yes, it's been used as an opportunity to export out of the public coffers a huge debt of deficit financing that is going to be used as a weapon on the necks of the working class in the future. Another round of austerity, just like they bailed out the banks. With the debt was used, the deficit was used to as an excuse to cut wages, cut the wealth, the share of wealth going to the working class to increase profitability, which is really at the heart of the crisis in capitalism, is the profitability crisis. This seems like a convenient way to exploit. I'm not saying no conspiracy theorist, the virus appeared, but this crisis, obviously, people in the capitalist class have experts who know how to game crisis and what they can, and have carefully choreographed fear and distraction techniques. While we're all looking one way, we're not looking at our hospitals that have got 100,000 less beds than they did 20 years ago. When we've got an aging population, we've got two graphs. One is our elderly people are getting older, therefore likely to need more hospitalisation, yet we've cut beds. So we've got a chart of beds, less beds. Who planned that? Who decided that we need less provision of healthcare as our population is getting older? So when we're living longer, it stands to reason we need more healthcare. We need more provision, not less. And those two factors alone have caused a huge amount. And we're now estimated in the Civitas report near on $500 billion. It's eye-watering. It's astonishing. It's almost imperceptible the amount conceivable amount of money that has been exported out of the public coffers. And yet working class are no better off. What have we got? I wouldn't mind if we had 5 new hospitals, a whole new load of care homes built. We've got jobs that have been created that are long-term future. $500 billion. would have, as it's a scandal that no doubt public inquiries that are going to ensue in the future about COVID will gloss over that situation, blame the NHS as being inadequate, and the final nail in the coffin of privatisation will be accelerated as an excuse that, to reorganise, in inverted commas, the usual euphemism to privatise the NHS will be used. This crisis will be used to completely remove the provision of healthcare free at the point of use, apart from core emergency services, no doubt. And the NHS logo will remain over the door. Government will continue to pay some wages directly to nurses and some doctors, but the aim that's been the aim since the inception of the NHS for the ruling class, this one little flick of social organisation, social care, will be extinguished, and that is one of the prime motives, I think, using this health crisis.
I mean, one aspect that came to my head earlier when you were saying that this was the history of panics. Panics can be real. The rise of Hitler. The economic crisis, 2008, 1981. A general strike, 1926. The First World War. You can have panics that have got, a genuine, tangible reality behind them.
Yeah.
And then you've got panics which are exaggerated. And of course, you can have a panic that justifies a war based on exaggeration, like Tony Blair, 2003, the invasion of Iraq. And everybody knows that there were no chemical bacteriological weapons. As I've said a few times, I thought they would invent them. I thought if they weren't there, they would plant them there.
I was going to say, if the police can plant some dope on any...
I was surprised they didn't find anything, which led me, of course, to be even more skeptical of conspiracy theory, because here you definitely had a conspiracy to say there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But the conspiracy was so thin that they weren't even able to provide the evidence after the fact to make it look like there was, which they probably could have done. If you're, if I murder someone in my flat, then afterwards, when the police come round, I may have gone home and cleared up the body and put someone else's fingerprint on a knife or something. You know what I mean? You'd think that they would be quite capable of doing that and willing to do that, but it wasn't the case. And so, and there have been a number of healthcare scares connected to pandemic threats, in particular the swine flu pandemic, but also Creutzfeldt-Jakob, mad cow disease, where both of the elements that have come together in this crisis came together at that time. One was an infectious disease that was declared a pandemic, and that governments around the world responded to by emergency purchase of vaccines with unproven efficacy, and eventually the destruction of those vaccines because they bought so many of them they were never used. Dead. We're back. You had an epidemic of testing, and this testing, the funny thing is, it was conducted, for example, in 2012 in Germany on every cow in Germany. And the people who are now the critical voices in Germany from within the scientific community who deal with these issues were pointing that out at the time, and they were saying, look, there is no real danger of Creutzfeldt-Jakob prion disease spreading either amongst the cows generally or amongst the human population generally. And yet they went round testing cow after cow after cow and slaughtering them. And it was the same with swine flu. And right at the moment, I don't know if they've ended it now, but a couple of weeks ago, they started a bird pandemic or bird epidemic hysteria in England. And all poultry birds just before Christmas were forced to go into cages. And so there were no, Christmas time had no free-range chickens or free-range ducks or free-range turkeys because they'd all been put in cages on the base of pandemic paranoia or epidemic paranoia. And so the history of the last 25, 30 years inside the pharmaceutical industry, inside the warning industry for epidemics, pandemics, this sort of thing, both for animals and man, and also in the testing to back that up, it's created giant industries with their own interests. And the interest of a testing industry is to have as many tests done as possible, because that's how you make your money. The interest of the pharma industry is to have some pandemic spread around that you can solve and that governments will pay for, because actually, Michael Roberts has been right on this, that there was developing vaccines is quite expensive job. Developing testing things can be, it's not really so expensive, it can be. So unless someone's pumping you with money, you're not going to do it. And so they got to a point where literally they were having money thrown at them every time they told a scare story. And the peculiarity is that in this particular field, epidemiology, virology, there's only a couple of players in the world. And they're the same people in each of the past pandemics. That's the peculiarity of it, is Neil Ferguson. He's been involved in every single one of these issues, every single one of them. Christian Drosten. And the mad thing about Drosten is Drosten invented the PCR test that's used today. It appears his document was published the day after it was written, so it wasn't peer reviewed. And the journal it was published in, Eurosurveillance, he's an editor on the journal, so it should never have been published. You can't peer review your own bloody journal. And then, but I found an article from 2000, I think it's 14, in the German economic magazine called Wirtschaftswoche, Economic Weekly, in which he was assessing the panic in Saudi Arabia about MERS. And MERS, again, is another SARS-related illness with a quite high death rate, actually. And he was assessing the PCR test because they asked him, well, what do you think of what's going on in Saudi Arabia and so on? He said, well, basically the pandemic, he says the epidemic of MERS in Saudi Arabia is over, but the problem is they keep testing. And he said the testing is so extensive, so massive, and it's hyped up by the media, who every day are only covering stories about MERS. And so because of that, the government, Saudi Arabia's government, has got billions at its disposal anytime it wants to. So they just invested the money on testing. And so they were testing wildly. And literally there's a quotation, I'm paraphrasing, but it's almost exactly what the quotation is. And he says, the PCR test is so sensitive that if you test a nurse, if a tiny little bit of the virus has somehow got into their nose and has done nothing to them, you'll turn up with a positive test. And that's what he said. It's just astounding, these things,
I actually read, I read that the PCR test can also pick up genetic material of other coronavirus, not just SARS-2.
That was admitted by Drosten himself.
That's crazy. So, of course, remnants of other coronaviruses that have been around the world for the last few years, it's almost inevitable that we're probably carrying remnants of those. What use is the PCR test? I think bringing the discussion back.
The PCR test. The PCR test can be used if it is a standardized system, so it's detecting the same thing. Yeah. So if I do 25 CT cycles, which is what Hennigan's been saying from the Centre of Evidence-Based Medicine, then you'll reach a level where you're on the border between knowing exactly who's ill and infectious and got the virus, or a virus causing something of that character, one of the coronaviruses, perhaps. And it will be useful to detect, that, are you symptomatic? Are you, and if it can detect that, then it's useful. But if you do one more cycle, then the comparison between your test and my test is no longer valid. And therefore you're not comparing like with like. And therefore you don't know what you're measuring. And this is the problem. And but it can be used in conjunction with diagnosis. And that's what the WHO, WHO is a bureaucratic institution, but they've been compelled on the 14th of December to accept that the PCR test cannot be used for diagnostic purposes, as actually Christian Drosten said at the very beginning. But you see, these are technicalities, and most people don't like the technicalities.
Yeah.
Even though they're perfectly logical, direct technicalities, most people are they don't form their opinion from actual science of the disease. And
of course not. And that's quite understandable for working class people. And I suppose that's where I'd like to bring the discussion back to. So what is the response of the labour movement? What should be the response? At the end of the day, for working class people, I'm lucky. One of the advantages of lockdown and not having a job is I've had an opportunity to read a bit and do some research. Most working class people don't have that opportunity. They are, in the hands of people with information, data, and therefore trust, mistakenly or not, what they're being told. That's not their fault. But it's, incumbent upon people in the labour movement to make sure that they orientate their position that is what is in the interest of our class. And unfortunately, it's become clear, like Brexit, this issue has been raised as a national issue, something above the classes, something more important than day-to-day politics, just like war. And I'm unfortunately seen a number of, generally a social democratic response, which is, let's suspend our politics for the moment.
But you remember when Emily Maitlis, quite early on, she said, oh, this is not an equal killer. And she spoke about inequality. They took her off telly for a day.
Yeah. And we've not really, I mean, there has been a few, lefty campaign group MPs trying to, they've touched on that lockdown or furlough has not been equal and etc. But it's been very lightweight. And in fact, we've now got the crazy situation where people on the left are calling for more draconian, stricter restrictions on life. I'm sure it's based on goodwill. I'm sure it's based on the best of intentions, but it's completely without understanding what the evidence is for what they're calling for. It's almost like I'm going to out you as being the most caring person in society because I'm a socialist. I must care more. I have more empathy. Therefore, I will call for more restrictions because that seems to be the only way we can stop this disease. And for me now, and as unpalatable as it sounds, and I think the government had a responsibility to be honest at the beginning of this, as a lot of epidemiologists have said, is that this virus cannot be stopped. It's not something you can have a zero COVID, zero SARS-2 society. The virus is there, it's out there, and it's doing what it is predicted to do. And rather than work on the basis that we've somehow made a mistake and this virus can be put back in its box, we should have been talking about how we can manage our lives sensibly, responsibly, looking after the people that need to be looked after, and everybody else can also then assess their own risks, what the risk is then, like I have to do every day. And what really annoys me is I've worked in the construction industry all my life. It's one of the worst industries for deaths, and not just death, but the fact that it is so dangerous with so many self-employed people taking risks to earn a few quid. No one's called for lockdown until we go back to building sites with no deaths. No one's called for lockdown where there's no deaths in, for workers anywhere. We're okay.
No one's called for lockdown on the construction industry.
No, exactly. No, precisely.
They up Portobello Road every couple of weeks is beyond me.
Well, actually, I was still employed when the lockdown just started that last week.
Yeah.
And obviously, some of the, I know for a fact that the building industry, trade bodies, whatever they are, they were the first to knock on Downing Street for an exemption, and they got it straight away. That never applied to them. Everybody, and then people were pressured, self-employed people, small contractors, pressured to get in their vans, drive 30 miles down the A12 or the A10 or wherever they've come from, get into the central London where all the work is, do their work, mixing, and no one cared. And it was, and actually I saw one email when I was
it'll be worthwhile looking at the actual stats on deaths there, because I think you'll find they aren't that high, despite what they.
I remember one email coming from a company saying, we do this for Britain. We'll do this to keep Britain afloat, the British economy afloat. We're all going to turn up for work. I mean, ridiculous nonsense, as though, nothing else matters. So we've never put the science.
I mean, it's like this madness about the supermarkets now. If they wanted to eradicate the danger that people caught a virus in a supermarket, then they would organize the provision of all houses by remote. So everyone would get deliveries, right? They could have given everyone like a £7 Uber voucher every day to get Uber Eats delivered to them every day.
Amazon into public ownership.
That nature, and they could have closed down the supermarkets and provided them, or only had them open to providers. So you could have, let's say, an ambassador for the street. 20 people who go to the supermarket, collect a list of things that people want on email, go to the supermarket and pick it up and deliver it. Or you could have an extension of the delivery system that existed. There was no interest in doing anything like that. And there never has been. And so all this crap about wearing face masks in the supermarket and people getting paranoid about the supermarket, it's just so much tosh, and it's easily disprovable, but people don't, most people don't want to listen, because they're paranoid. And unfortunately, with the left, I mean, I've tried to work out why this has happened, but the left is basically, in my opinion, it's because they have a propensity, they tend to be more closely associated with the public sector. They tend to have this affinity to the institution, all this crap about love the NHS. The NHS is an organization with a machine. It's like years ago, over the last few years, remember, it used to be the thing, all these stupid right-wing Labour people would say, I love the Labour Party, right? You can't love the Labour Party. You can love people in the Labour Party. You can't love the party. It's just stupid. I mean, it's like the Soviet Union.
Well, I think the NHS has a symbolic. It has as an organisation, it does have a symbolic link to a socialised approach to medicine. So I'm not going to, I think that's okay, and I understand what I don't think. Of
course, but the con is to associate people with the NHS from before, which of course is a historical memory of welfarism after the Second World War and whatever, and what you have now, which is a semi-privatized entity that is run by trust managers who have more in common with football team managers than with healthcare managers. It's just nonsensical. So you got to distinguish what the NHS. The NHS is public health. That's all it is. And public health is not an institution. It's not an ambulance driver, a nurse, and a doctor. Public healthcare is everything to do with health from birth till death.
Sure. External. It's
food, nutrition, education. It's the whole the whole caboodle. That's what health is.
And of course, when I talk about the left collapse, I'm not really just, and I think another aspect that's crept in here, which again just came very clear to me, is a nationalist kind of approach. If this, even on its own terms, if you take it on its own terms, if this is a world pandemic, why are we just talking about Britain And where is the left as an international exchanging information, talking about ideas about how to organise and protect working class people in Spain, in France? So it seems to me
not only the left, the entire academic community in the world, including the so-called scientific community on epidemiology, they don't even talk to each other.
Yeah.
You know, the British SAGE committee does not discuss with the German Robert Koch Institute or with the various committees advising the German government. They'll have a teleconference once every frigging month, if that.
Yeah.
And that'll be one person, you know. Oh, I spoke to my German colleague the other day for 20 minutes. But they don't go over the material. They don't have systematic translation. They don't have, you know, interchange. And so it's a complete farce.
And ordinary people probably would expect that to happen. I'm shocked, you know. Yeah.
They think that behind SAGE there must be all these geniuses doing all these things. They're doing F all.
And you know, we're not really, yeah, exactly. So there should have been a much higher level or higher kind of caliber of discussion taking place in the public domain on TV shows, where we are looking at how other countries. We got plenty of news, actually, to be fair, from the USA, how bad it was in the USA, which obviously was used to compare how lucky we were in Britain. But there has been other examples of different approaches, because I do think if we're going to say the part of this discussion is about why we're against lockdown, then we need to say what we're for. The lockdown itself is complete waste of money. I mean, it's a complete expense that is not serving any purpose. So what are we asking for then? What should we be saying? And you can take, you know, that's where the discussion should be between different nations, between different health sectors, to see what works. Because I think it's about looking at pragmatic solutions, and then through watching the data to check and evaluate, and then make sure that you're on the right track. But generally, you know, we aren't doing that. There's no international discussions. It's guarding your data, not sharing it with others unless pushed. So there isn't a nationalistic kind of approach to this, which I think is it's driven by certain capitalists seeing an opportunity to come out of this, market share, better market share, maybe their competitors destroyed or weakened. You can never escape from the fact that in the end of the day, you know, we're living in a capitalist society where they will take advantage and use any kind of
I agree that, but I do think, although there are people like Charles Schwab who propose Great Reset and so on, so there's an idiotic thing in the newspaper yesterday, on the BBC yesterday, saying, or I came across on the BBC saying, Great Reset, it's a theory, conspiracy theory, that there's a plan to take, you know, that the pandemic was, but that's not what Great Reset is. Great Reset is an actual group of capitalists, leading capitalists in the world, who've been thinking for some time that there needs to be a mission-based capitalism in order to replace the rate of profit as the driving force. I mean, they don't think it that way. They just think mission-based capitalism, that's a good idea. And because the multi-billionaires are so wealthy nowadays, they can take power in countries and they can shape agendas according to their whims. So Bill Gates has got 100 billion invested in the Bill and Gates Melinda Foundation, which is a huge amount of money for any institution to have. And it makes them one of the biggest players in the World Health Organization. These are facts. That doesn't make Bill Gates Satan, but it makes him pretty dodgy, and it makes his influence dodgy on the dynamics of research, of pandemic response, of his influence over vaccination policy and all this. It's enormous. It's, you know, how do you know it? What do you mean? It means that you and I, in comparison, have no influence. So how many people have to weigh? You know, there used to be a mate of mine was in the Ismailis, I think they're called, and they have this Aga Khan, you know, like the song, you know, the Aga Khan bought you a racehorse for Christmas because he was a bit of a gambler. Oh, and yeah, what they did was the Aga Khan would eat loads and loads of chickens, so he'd get more and more heavy. And then they would weigh him every year against gold. So he would always get the gold on this, literally on on a scale thing where he would sit on one side and he'd eat so much to try and get more gold. So they would put the gold and have to balance it, and then he gets the gold. And it's literally like that. What's the weight of Bill Gates compared to you and I? How many millions of human beings would have to, you know, put their hand up and say, I want to say about this, in order to have as big a say as Bill Gates? Well, the answers itself. Obviously, the whole of Africa does not, you know, 1 billion people, does not have as much influence as Bill Gates. That's a simple fact. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's a fact.
Yeah.
So too,
and he, you know, he would, and he should be. We should be suspicious of his philanthropy. We should be suspicious of any.
The point is, if he dies tomorrow, the institution continues, and so the institution is funding research in specific directions, and so that directional trajectory, which is pushed by a gigantic investment program, pulls behind it all sorts of other forces as well. Yeah. You know, that's where the trough is, and so that all the pigs gather around that trough to like run after it to get the resources. Yeah. If you want to apply, if you like, government's got a program called Innovate, right? And Innovate from the beginning of the pandemic was offering grants to businesses, institutions, and so on who want to do research on the pandemic, and the fields covered everything. So if you wanted to do Marxists and the COVID pandemic, at the beginning at least, there was a pretty high chance that if you had a company, that you'd get like £100,000 research grant to do it. And the same with anything else. You know, I'm going to study the interconnection between baldness. And there's a funny thing, I saw this yesterday. There's a study around the world that says bald people are more likely to die of COVID. Right? Sorry. You're not bald, don't you? Just shaved. But I mean, this is madness, because then later on it says, well, there could be a connection between the fact that most people who die are male and are over 85 years of age or 80 years of age, and therefore they're more likely to be bald. Right? Yeah. This guy had actually spent some time looking at fucking baldness. I mean, that's how mad these people are, or how mad the research can be that gets funded. Now, it's an obscure example, but it shows the way in which the pull of capitalism in a certain direction, and it's not because any of them have a, well, I mean, the capitalists have always got different agendas. The tech sector, you got to remember, has been given this, has acquired this power to drive the direction of a society in ways that was never expected, or was barely expected. Don't forget, 2010, the Arab Spring, people called it the Facebook revolution, right? Then there was Cambridge Analytica, who claimed they had determined the outcome of elections in Kenya, the Trump election, and Brexit. Now, whether that's a false claim or not doesn't matter that much. The perception was there, and probably the facts as well, that they were able to sway opinion in one way or another, you know, in the decisive, the extra 1% they needed, right? Yeah. And we all know that the internet and artificial intelligence have gone, if you like, out of control. Michael Roberts, I did an interview with him. We were talking about artificial intelligence. Was it an interview with him? Anyway, I saw it. Either he said it or it was an interview with him. And he said, on the board of the biggest banks, you'll have three, let's say you've got 3 voting people. 2 of them are humans. 1 of them is an AI algorithm. And they have a vote, right? And of course, if the AI algorithm is saying one thing all the time, and someone decides to go along always with the AI algorithm, the other person's also going to pull along with it, you know, even if their AI algorithm is completely wrong. And we spot it all the time. Sometimes you're looking for something on the internet and something bizarre comes up and you think, what the hell is that come up for? And that's because the AI algorithm has got you wrong. Yeah. And of course they get people wrong, and because they're not human. It's just a machine. And the machine, in a dynamic period of change, is bound to get things wrong. And so and this was the case with the students, the A-level students. Don't forget that. I mean, no human would have thought that up. Only a machine could do that. A human can input the data stupidly. That might be some pig-headed, ignorant, upper-class toff putting in the parameters of the data to correspond with his own prejudices. Out comes the result out of the machine. All the working class kids have been pushed down. Well, it's the same processes that led, if you like, to the excess debt. I mean, the care home decision. How did that happen? How did the decision happen to kick these people out of the hospitals into the care homes? Was it a human decision? Was it a human artificial intelligence decision? You know,
I think
we're not going to data now. But when it comes out, you know, you might well find that a lot of these decisions, and then a lot of them are based on this madness from Neil Ferguson. Don't forget, him and other modelers have been central to the whole discussion, not only here but around the world.
I think it's an important point that on the decision, the excess deaths that no doubt have took place in 2020, a massive proportion of those. 50,000, possibly more.
25 is the care homes. Yeah.
Took place in March, and out of that, a huge proportion. You're saying that's probably half. Then 25
of the COVID deaths, it's half or more than half.
And and they took place because it's probably more about, again, the lack of bed provision in the NHS. There is a carefully choreographed process that has to happen all the time for bed management, and there was panic. There were beds being blocked, and it's a horrible term, but bed blocking, and they run out of beds. They had to start.
They did when they say that, but they didn't run out of beds because they had the bloody 12,000 beds in Elizabeth, and also in the in the Excel Centre and all the other places they opened up. And so it was an organizational decision-making failure. That's all it is. It's got nothing to do with lack of beds. You know, what is a bed, you know? And they had beds with medical facilities associated with them.
And it's care. Yeah, but they don't have the staff. So there was
they did have the staff.
That was a performative gesture, a virtue signal. Look at China, they built a hospital. Look, we can do the same thing. But no intention of ever using it.
That's true.
And there is a finite resource in the NHS. It's under-resourced, and there is a crisis, and that's why we have this winter crisis every year. And that is a real thing. It's not invented. There is not enough provision for the healthcare that is needed, and the modelers have done that on purpose. They're honest. I think there's honest projections, but they're ignored. There is honest people in NICE.
The initial discussion was, remember, and the Chinese, actually coming back to a point you made earlier on, just quickly, the Chinese they're not very good at propaganda and explanation and stuff like that, but they did, unlike the rest of the countries, they did offer seminars and discussions online from what they knew to the rest of the world. So I know they were doing a lot in Africa. They were doing, they were a bit boring and dull, but they did provide basic information about what they'd done in China to try and contain the epidemic and what they'd learned. They did do that, which Britain has not been doing. Britain, you just get crap from government ministers. In China, the guy who was in charge of the operation, it's a bit like with Sweden. In Sweden, Tegnell, the chief epidemiologist, was in charge of the campaign and policy. And so it was in China with Zhongnan Shan. And Zhongnan Shan was the lead epidemiologist in the SARS-1 epidemic or pandemic, and he was in charge of this. And it's him you would see on telly. You wouldn't see Xi Jinping on telly. Xi Jinping just comes and pats the guy on the back. He doesn't want to be personally responsible for every decision that happens in the country. Only afterwards did he say, oh, I was at this meeting, I decided this, I decided that. But actually, the real decisions were taken by the epidemiologists, and then they went to Beijing and discussed it, which of course provided a certain cover for Beijing, just in case things went wrong. But at the same time, there was some logic behind it. And Zhongnan Shan said he wasn't opposed to the Swedish, what they were doing. He said, he pointed to what the British had said, actually. And I've seen a number of videos where he did this. And he said, well, this idea of, how much can the health service cope with? And how do we flatten the curve to prevent it all breaking down? And he accepted all of that. The problem was that the parameters of the curve in the NHS was set by the policies the government had carried out over the previous 10 years. That's what caused the crisis. And that's the case all over Europe where these things happened. So let me plug in. Where the disasters happen. Having said that, there almost certainly is, I sent you a paper a while ago, I remember, there almost certainly is an element of longitude and latitude to the illness, to the spread of the disease, and which is it's just a factual, Africa and India have not been hit significantly by, no matter, yes, numbers are high, but numbers in comparison to total deaths, it's minimal in India, it's minimal in Africa, and it was absolutely minimal in China. Now, the issue is, would it have remained minimal had they done nothing? Of course, we don't have the evidence. We don't have the evidence for that, except for the fact there was gigantic mass migration in China at the time. So, it's difficult to say in China. And the proviso, of course, is in China, which we were talking about earlier on, but anyway, I'll repeat it again now, was that most people in the big cities live in giant housing blocks that are almost like cruise ships. So you'll have thousands of people living in a single block of housing. And so if all of them went in and out as usual, the chance of spreading the virus inside the building would be very high. And that's why there was, no matter what you think about lockdown or not lockdown, there was a certain logic that's justifiable to a lockdown in a big city where everyone lives in tower blocks with thousands of people. There is a certain logic to that. And then to provide food to the houses, like we're saying, provide, basically they had Uber provision of food. And that Uber provision of food meant a certain time of day, you come down and collect your food. And to do that for a few weeks, well, like you said, that's understandable and acceptable in a way. But to make this a year-long chaos, which is what, I was just watching, earlier on I was watching something yesterday. This was December. It was actually, I think it was the beginning of November when I got arrested on a demonstration. And I saw a Chinese report on the same demonstration. And then they had the picture of the demonstration and people shouting freedom, blah, 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 anti-lockdown. And then it showed Boris Johnson on telly saying everything will be fine by Christmas. Well, how can you believe people who constantly move the goalposts? People expect some consistency. And that, of course, is one of the elements of this type of neo-Stalinist mindset that some people have developed, which means that they see it like a military operation. In other words, if everyone was disciplined like a soldier, or disciplined like a proletarian or the production line has to be, otherwise the production line falls apart, then the problem could be solved by a rigorous hard lockdown. That's what these people imagine. And that's what the zero COVID theorists imagine. But of course, the provision, you'd have to have that type of provision that you had in China to do that. And we don't have that. And there's no indication that such a force to bring such a change about exists, nor even that the army is capable of doing that in Britain. And so all we do is stumble from pillar to post, from chaos to chaos. That literally is where we're at.
Yeah, and I mean, even if you take the lockdowns, and I say lockdowns in plural because you're never really so confused about where you are and what stage you're in most of the time anyway. We've had tiers, we've had stages.
I've got no idea where we are now. I've got no idea.
All kinds of experiments, which is fair enough on that level. It's okay in principle to try different things, as long as you're honest and evaluate.
For a month or 2 months, yes, but not for a year. This is just frigging.
Having said that, even this lockdown now, which is supposed to be the strictest it gets, this is it. It's a proper lockdown. There are hundreds of thousands, if not possibly millions, of workers who can't lock down, who can't just stay at home because they have to work, or they're actually compelled to work for one reason or another. Either they've got people.
Worse than that is it's not even the workers. Workers who are reasonably healthy are not going to die. I mean, I say not going to. 1 in 5,000 or 1 in 10,000 might die, which is nothing because that can happen anyway, as you say, on a construction site or any other normal circumstances. But amongst the over 70s, the risk is much higher. And so, again, it's about protection of the over 70s. And They don't have it. They don't have some account, right, for over 70s that ensures that they can buy from Sainsbury's and get delivered online. There has been no such provision for these people. They don't have any guarantee. I see people walking down the street round here, old people, mask hanging off their face that they've worn 300 times, bent over double and looking at everyone in utter fear. It's just heartbreaking to see the madness that has conquered society. And then these people proclaim they're achieving some objective by saying to that old person the same thing they say to a 19-year-old student. You know, it's just, where's the, you know, a doctor doesn't turn around to someone who's 90 or 80-year-old or 90-year-old and tell them the same as an 18-year-old. They don't say, oh, look, you need to watch your bloody diet because you're such and such, you know, which you might say to an 80 or 90-year-old. I mean, it's just, and that means that medicine is not what we're doing.
Yeah.
You know, it's just, it literally is just lunacy. But it appeared each time to the government, it appeared logical. And that's where you get anarchy with capitalism. Then you get the anarchy of the advisory services. You get the advisory services have been lobbied to create the cluster of people who've been advising, which Yeadon correctly points out, Mike Yeadon, a former Pfizer scientific officer, correctly points out, they didn't have an immunologist until June. No immunologist. Well, if you don't have an immunologist, how do you know what you're talking about? Nothing. They got all these 100 scientists who are supposedly helping out, including anthropologists, you know, historians. What a shit show.
I think it's the same on stage, isn't it? They didn't.
That's stage. That's what I'm saying. That's stage.
Oh, right. They didn't have an
three departments. One modelling department.
Epidemiologist. They didn't have
it's like modelling department. They might as well have a modelling department with what, you know, Naomi Campbell on it, as far as I can see.
Ethics.
Yeah, that as well. And then they've got non-pharmaceutical interventions, which means lockdown. Well, there is no lockdown handbook. There never has been. It's never been used before the term. And then they've got the psychological operations, who are designed to behavioral, they call it, which means to manipulate the population to get them to do what they want. It's just freaking madness. It's just run and run and run, and they've got no escape because they were always right, you know.
Of course, and I think
we've been talking nearly an hour. I think we should draw it to a close.
Yeah, I think the other point as well, because I think there's a number of strands to try and explain a very on the face of it, an inexplicable series of decision making by the government. But the other thing that we've not touched on is their ideology of a market-based solution at all costs has prohibited them from at least openly looking like they're putting extra money into the NHS. I mean, you could have nationalised, you could have taken to public ownership, as you say, delivery services. You could have set something up, you could have taken over, you know, and that would have left a lasting legacy post-COVID, which would have been a reform that would not have been taken away easily. So, for instance, you could easily have produced, for the cost, hundreds, thousands more beds, tens of thousands more beds into the NHS. But we're not going to allow it to be taken away. I think the government have clearly shown, you know, they are not interested in solutions that would benefit in any long-term thing. But of course, the rich have benefited out of this massively. It's been a huge payday, like undreamt of wealth has landed into the hands of certain people.
There are some billionaires who've made a gigantic killing, and everyone knows who they are, the tech sector. And actually, funny enough, there was a list of the top 100 companies who benefited during coronavirus. 36 of them were Chinese, you know. But of course, that's also partly behind the battle now in China with Alibaba. You know, why do the Chinese want to seize control of tech? Because they know tech has become so powerful that it's got bigger data than the Chinese government. It's got potentially a greater network of distribution and connections and of potential financing and of manufacturing interconnected with that. And therefore, they seem to be on the point of nationalizing Alibaba, which will be one of the most extraordinary nationalizations in world. They might couch it in some other terms, but that seems to be what's happening. And of course, that is actually what should happen. And, you know, like you say, they should have unified all the delivery services and expanded them, just like as they built these Nightingale hospitals, they should have built, I don't know what you'd call it, Speedy Gonzales delivery service run by the state, with people who were previously employed doing X, Y, and Z, now given good facilities, good employment, not running around on bicycles delivering packages on their back, but instead given a little van like these tuk-tuks they drive in China, and they should be driving all around the country delivering the necessities to the people in the event of such an emergency. Because it was an emergency at the beginning because no one knew what was going to happen. And as the emergency, this is the problem. People don't seem to understand. You go into a lockdown, if you're going to do a lockdown, in order to come out of it, not in order to stay in it.
And also for the lockdown to actually do something, to do something.
How do you get out of it? It's almost like when they went to Iraq, when they went to Iraq, everyone turned around and said at the end, yeah, but where was the post-occupation planning, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what it is. They go into lockdown, but we've got no plan to come out of it.
Well, okay. I think I will finish on this. The mid-February target date for the relaxing restrictions is not a coincidence. It's a very convenient date because it marks the beginning of the end of the winter respiratory illness cycle. Yeah,
of course.
So numbers of deaths and infection rates will go down anyway.
Probably go down from next few weeks.
And the government will then claim that lockdown was responsible for this decline, when in fact, when you look at every year, the decline takes place at the same time.
And that's quite clear in the article from Ferguson a couple of days ago. It's quite clear he's saying that.
Funny enough, as well, I only saw last night, there was an interview with someone from Oxford AstraZeneca. She's the front lady, one of the scientists, very, very, very camera friendly. Interviewed on prime time, 6 o'clock TV, saying how wonderful it is and what a great job they've done. Then the interviewer asked her, she said, well, how long will this immunity last once everyone gets it? She said, well, we're not really sure on that. Actually, they've mooted 6 to 8 months, possibly, not sure, which coincidentally and funny enough, will get us to September, October next year, which is the beginning of the next cycle of winter respiratory illnesses, and they'll be blamed. So this vaccine, I'm skeptical if the vaccine is actually going to do anything. If we're coming out of the winter respiratory illness cycle anyway, what's the point? Because corona will recede because it's seasonal. And if the vaccine itself, they're saying, they're not really sure how long it's going to last. They don't say it's a permanent immunity. It's a temporary immunity. I don't actually believe it's actually going to do anything. I can't see what the point of it is, because by the time we get to next September, they're going to say the vaccine's run out of immunity. So what do we do then?
Yeah, but then they could argue. One is that's about antibody immunity, not about T-cell immunity. Two is, and whether it will stimulate T-cell immunity. Well, the mRNAs, I just wouldn't let anyone. I wouldn't recommend anyone take it. We don't know what it's going to do. It could provoke autoimmune reaction. We don't know. When you get a real infection from something, we don't know. And then as to the AstraZeneca, well, I've seen some different reports. The problem is it's all being rushed, and you shouldn't rush a bloody vaccine, no matter what happens. And we should. The so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions, well, we could have done non-pharmaceutical interventions that actually protected people. Yeah. And we haven't. It's as simple as that. There's been
about that, actually, the Oxford spokesperson last night and said, and actually the interview was quite strange. She said, you've rushed this out. Why should people trust it? And she said, we haven't rushed this. We've been researching this since 2010, since SARS-1. It's not something, that's the perception I want to scotch. To be fair. Oxford AstraZeneca said that they've been working on the virus, the SARS-1, the coronavirus group of coronaviruses since for 8 to 10 years. And so this is not actually something they just picked up, but it accelerated in the last year, of course, but it's based on data and research they've been doing. But the point is they've accelerated. I think what's happened is, to be precise, is the trials and the long-term trials that you would normally relate and expect with a vaccine have been ignored or have been
more importantly behind it all, which is what Yeadon and Vodok said in their petition to the European Medicines Agency and a similar petition to the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. How do you measure the success of the vaccine? The success of the vaccine was measured by PCR tests. And the PCR test is known to be inaccurate. And so you're measuring, if your measurement is inaccurate, then your results are bound, you might turn up with a perfectly good drug. I don't know. But this hocus pocus method of doing it, it's like witch doctorism, try this one, see if it works. Basically what it is.
And although, it's obviously right and proper to say that, well, the groups, the most vulnerable, the elderly, well, they're also experimenting, effectively on the elderly.
It's disgusting, I know, it's disgusting.
So the elderly now are going to be the guinea pigs, ready for, generate, the next age groups down, 50s and 60s. And also other countries, certainly countries that don't have a problem.
And if you ask the companies how many over 65-year-olds with comorbidities they tested it on, well, the number goes down to 0. Yeah. So, it's just extraordinary. Anyway, we've been talking for a long time.
We have.
Let's do this again soon.
Yep.
All right. I'll end it.